Good afternoon, or welcome on the stroke of afternoon here. This is the third of four sessions for SBN on the Gift to the Gulf series. I'm Andy Kenworthy from the Sustainable Business Network. SBN's work in the Gulf centres on business engagement to restore the mauri, the life-giving essence of Tikapa Moana, Te Moananui-a-Toi. This project received funding from Gulf Innovation Fund Together, a Foundation North initiative, and from Auckland Council. Many thanks to them for making this possible. This is the third of four sessions. It comprises a unique online event to take a deeper, closer look at this body of water, its current condition, and what we must all do about it. So far, we've had sessions on the wonders of the Gulf, featuring Auckland MP Chloe Swarbrick and James Frankham, publisher and director of New Zealand Geographic. It was a fantastic session. And yesterday we had Restoring the Gulf, featuring Michael Mars, Peter Miles and Mark Russell, all working hands-on and underwater to restore the Gulf back to its former glory. Great sessions, both still available to view on our Facebook page. So go back and look at them once you've enjoyed today's session. Tomorrow we'll be looking at how transport choices affect the Gulf in our final session. And today's session again is getting plastics out of the Gulf, where we'll be talking about the obvious and less obvious impacts of plastics in the Gulf and what we can do about them. Remember, there's prizes to be won throughout these sessions, including taking a pledge to help restore the Gulf. You can go to sustainable.org.nz, gift to the Gulf, take your pledge there on a simple action you can take to help the Gulf, whether that's picking up litter or planting trees. There's many, many different options. And you go on there and you get in to win a zilch weekend of free EV car hire or Lewis Road Creamery ice cream. So top fun to be had there. And registering and then sending all four sessions. If you've got this far with us, you've only got one more to go, and that will get you in to win a double pass on an Auckland whale and dolphin safari, which will get you up close and personal to the Gulf itself and see some of the fantastic science work that they do. And today's special prize is Kelly Tarleton's family pass. And what you need to do to win that is comment about in our Facebook page about someone doing great work to keep plastics out of the Gulf. That's a family prize pass to Kelly Tarleton's. Awesome place to go, and again, get to know the Gulf in depth. So today we have Devina Shetty, microplastics researcher from the University of Auckland. We've got Darren Tiddy from Stormwater 360. They're all about trapping litter from in stormwater before it can get out to the waters. And James Ferrier, CEO of BioFab, and they're replacing plastics with better alternatives, and clever stuff it is too. So we've given each of them 8 minutes to put forward their own unique perspective on what their work can do for the Gulf and how important it might be. And after that, we'll have a panel discussion to throw around some ideas, where I'll also be delving deep into their sort of personal relationship with the Gulf and why they think this is so important. So throughout, add your questions and into the Q&A box on the Zoom. If you're with us on Zoom, if you're out there on Facebook, chuck it into the comments page. We will transfer it across and attempt to address those in our Q&A. You're with us for about an hour. Sit back, relax, grab a sandwich, and thank you so much for your time. Devina, I'd like to bring you up and get us started. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Andy. Thank you for having me. I'll just introduce myself. Kia ora koutou. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Devina, and I'm a microplastics researcher who just recently completed her master's thesis, working in collaboration with the Institute of Marine Science and with the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. And it's a pleasure to be able to share a bit of my work with you today, titled The Incidence of Microplastics in Inshore Fish Species and Surface Waters in the Hauraki Gulf. So I'll start sharing my screen now. And Andy, just let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, perfect.
All right. All right, so I'll just walk you through my research, what my objectives were, my results, and what we can do collectively to help make a difference. So a bit of our background, what is microplastics? Microplastics are plastics that are smaller than 5 millimeter in length, and they can be anything from shards broken off larger pieces or microbeads from cosmetic use. They have now been banned, but most of the plastic comes from synthetic fibers from our clothing. And soon scientists began noticing that these tiny pieces of plastic are polluting our oceans and affecting our marine habitat. And as you can see in the graph here, a study done in 2014, they estimated that we have about 5.25 trillion pieces of plastics in our oceans, making our oceans into what I would call a cesspool of toxicity. Now, how does it affect marine life? They cause an array of detrimental effects. They can affect their physiology, their metabolism, their growth. A recent study also observed that they increased the likelihood of disease in coral from 4% to 89%. And we already know that corals are a very fragile ecosystem. They also act as a magnet for toxic chemicals. So they act both as a sink and a source for microplastics. So they absorb microplastics and leach them out too. And a study done in 2017 in Canterbury, they observed that mussels that ingested plastics had lower energy reserves or fat reserves. And for our megafauna, as we know, for our turtles, whales, and dolphins, it leads to intestinal blockages, a false sense of satiation, and they also can also lead to death. So why is it so important to quantify and get accurate, reliable marine debris data? Ongoing research can help aid in the improvement as well as the adjustment of environmental legislature on a national and an international level. We can optimize our waste management practices, recycle, reuse, and it also helps educate our current and future civil society on sustainable practices. So moving to a more of a local perspective, these are pictures taken when I was a marine research intern with Auckland Whale and Dolphin Safari. And as you can see, our Gulf is thriving with life. We are home to 1/3 of the world's seabird species, and we know 90% of seabirds ingest plastic. We are a hot spot for sharks when it comes for their breeding grounds, and we know sharks are very, very important for our ecosystem. They help maintain a healthy balance of fish populations, and it's home to 22 marine mammal species. So it's imperative that we do all we can to protect our Gulf. So moving on to the aims of my research. So what I did was investigated the factors that influence the presence of microplastics in fish. So I looked at 6 common species of fish in the Gulf and divided them into pelagic and demersal species. So I looked at if fish feeding at the upper surface levels of the water ingested more or less plastic compared to fish that feed at the ocean seafloor, like gurnard or flounder. I also looked at proximity to urban areas. So if fish caught closer inshore, like fish caught from Waitemata Harbor, had more or less plastics compared to fish caught from the Great Little Barrier Island or Great Barrier Island, and if fish plastics were transferred from prey to predator. I also looked at for filter feeding fish such as pilchards, if there was an uptake of microplastics through their gills. Lastly, I quantified the polymer type, that is the type of plastic, their size, the number and color using a spectroscopy tool known as FTIR or Raman. Now, these are the geographical markers in the Gulf where the fish in my study were caught. Larger circles represent more fish were caught in this area. Additionally, I also quantified the amount of floating plastic debris in our surface water. I did this using a plankton net and a flow meter attached. The captain dispatches it at the stern of the boat, and we trawl it for about 5 minutes at a speed of 2 to 3 knots. And then the flow meter helps us assess the volume of water we filter through. So for every trawl, we filter through about 35,000 liters of water. And we also get to know the surface area that we've trawled. And then we get a sample in a glass jar. And like you can see here, and we filter it and we look at the number of plastics. So did we find anything? And if we did, what did we find? So we found various different types of plastics from fish from all 6 species. As you can see, we have filaments and films and fragments and fibers from jack mackerel, pilchard, and flounder. And from our water samples, we found 500 pieces of plastic from 39 trawls. Again, these varied, but most of them were less than 1 millimeter in length, and common colors were blue and black. Now, in order to determine that what I found is indeed plastic, and I want to have more accurate results. So sometimes they can be sediment or glass or metal, because it's quite tedious to look at it in the microscope, and we researchers might make a mistake and misidentify. So we take these plastics and pass it through a spectrometer, an infrared light, and they tell us if the plastics are polyethylene, polystyrene, or styrofoam. So most of the plastic we found were of the polyethylene type. And we found a total of 121 pieces of plastic across 70 species of fish. So we had 305 specimens, and the average ingestion rate across all 6 species was about 25%. So 1/4 of the fish in the Gulf had plastics in them. About 5% of pilchard samples had plastics in the gills of the pilchard, and about 7.5% of kahawai had plastics that were ingested from their prey. And this is the map of where I collected my water samples in the Gulf. And as I said earlier, the total number of plastics we found were 500 pieces exactly. And the average number of particles per sampling sites was about 13 plastic particles, with an average concentration of 931 pieces of plastics per square kilometer. So what can we do to help? The best thing, the number one thing we can do to make a big difference is making sure we live a sustainable lifestyle in our practices and the food we eat, especially fish, making sure it's sustainably sourced. Unfortunately, as Kiwis, we are one of the most wasteful countries in the world. We produce 70 times more waste than the average person in a developing country. So as you can imagine, that's a monumental amount of waste that's completely unnecessary. So the more many countries around the world have refused single-use plastic. And if we can take a picture of a black hole, then we can definitely find alternative uses, alternative materials to plastic. So make sure you refuse single-use plastic. Make sure you buy local produce. There's no need for us to buy fruits cut up in plastic containers. And make sure you reduce food waste and find other plastic alternatives. It's very important to remember that plastic is not the enemy here. Plastic is a very proprietary material, without which we wouldn't be able to go to space even. But it's important to remember that plastic is not the problem, but the way we utilize plastic is what makes the biggest difference. Lastly, a big thank you. I couldn't have done this alone. I had hundreds of helping and guiding hands. I had an army of people helping me. NIWA let me use their lab equipment. I collected samples to Auckland Whale and Dolphin Safari. The fish factory, Sanford, gave me some fish, and recreational fishermen who very happily gave me their fish guts to analyze. All right, I have now come to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Devina. A snapshot there of the kind of insidious nature of plastic, and also a snapshot of kind of how much potential life there is there. You know, we're still seeing those top species, but the kind of ebbing away of the life underneath if we're not too careful. Do keep those questions coming into the Q&A as we go through. We'll crouch them when we have a discussion at the end. I see a few are coming through already. Fantastic. And we'll move on now to Darren Tiddy, who's going to come forward and talk to us about his company's approach to waste and how it can help us to clean up our Gulf. Darren.
Tēnā koutua. Thank you very much, Andy. Let me just start this presentation. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit of trash. Just an update on what Stormwater 360 have been doing on the research front, and just maybe a bit of a discussion about regulations. There's a lot of change in regulations, so I think it's worth just touching on that. So We're a stormwater management company. We've been operating in New Zealand for over 25 years, and we are quite passionate about treating stormwater. There's a lot of pollutants in stormwater, metals and nutrients coming from our cars, our buildings, but also a lot of litter coming from people. So this is a bit of a landmark paper on the amount of litter going to our oceans. Jenna Jambek and her colleagues published this in Science in 2015, but it's based on 2010 data. So what you can see here is as coastal population increases, you've got an increase in mismanaged plastic waste. So if we pick out good old New Zealand here in the middle, 2010 we had 3.9 million people, 10,000 tons of mismanaged plastic waste. If we want to aspire to be at least at the bottom end, so the best of the bunch, we need to reduce our plastic waste by more than 10 times. And obviously these numbers will have increased over the last 10 years. So we've got a long way to go, and certainly then a much further way to go towards zero. So just focusing on some of our research, so littering in our Gulf. We do a lot of litter surveys and things using some of our technologies, and I'll take you through a few examples of what we found. So litter in Auckland is, we've looked at a few shopping centres that would, drain directly to the Hauraki Gulf, and you can see we've done a few studies sort of on a half a year basis, and we're getting between 800 and 1,200 pieces of litter per catch pit. So that's the catch pit that's right next to the vehicle as you get out. We've done a shop in Newland where we got over 1,000 pieces of litter in 12 months, but we only looked at 2 of the 13 catch pits. So if we were to extrapolate that, that's nearly 7,000 pieces of litter coming off that site in just 1 year. We did a study at a school in Wellington where in just 84 days we captured over 1,300 cigarette butts. So if you extrapolate all of that out, there's more than 11,000 pieces of litter going in that catch pit, and this was school children running this study. So that's quite something. Huge numbers. And we've just finished up a 1-year study on Waiheke Island, so the heart of the Hauraki Gulf, we think. And 34 drains we looked at across the island, and we took samples every couple of weeks, and we try to come up with some trends. So this is what we captured, more than 25,000 pieces of litter, and the majority of that is plastic. So you can see a whole range. The biggest single item was cigarette butts by far, and that fits with international studies that cigarette butts are the most polluted single item across the whole world. So this is what the data looks like. More than 8,000 cigarette butts. All the purple squares are different types of plastics, and altogether makes up about 75% or 70% of the litter in total. Quite a bit of glass and wood and paper, which is maybe not as detrimental when it gets into the receiving environment, but certainly hard pieces of plastic have the potential to break down and form microplastics that Devina was telling us about. Polystyrenes are they'll just float away and be just good, good to ingest for the fish. So what we found through this big study is the majority of litter that enters the waterways is made of plastic, certainly entering drains, and then that drains either directly to the ocean or into rivers. So of those 34 drains that we monitored, 25,000 pieces of litter, more than 18,000 of those were plastic. So if you're looking at plastics in the Hauraki Gulf, well, Waiheke we think is probably a relatively green area compared to maybe some industrial sites on the mainland. So we think this is just a snapshot view, and a lot more research can be done and a lot more effort can be put into capturing litter coming out of our out of our pockets, out of our back of the car, out the back of the ute. Just to quickly touch on some news and regulation, last week there was this sort of wild story that New Zealand might be excluded from climate summit discussions because there's this notion that there's a bit of a gap between ambition and reality. Well, this is quite extreme, and I don't think we should all fall into this as a bit of a clickbait trap. But just thought I'd give you an update on the things that we know are happening on the regulatory front. So what we know is there's going to be a lot of change coming. We've just declared a climate disaster, and microplastics, plastics into our waterways is definitely part of that bigger story. So at a high level, we've got 3 waters reform program that the Department of Internal Affairs are running. You've got the RMA review, which is going into consultation now, and that's being led mainly through the MFE. And then we've got 3 that affect us directly. The one is the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management, and this puts Te Moananui-a-Toi at the heart of managing freshwater. So you wouldn't imagine there's much money in the water if there's a lot of plastic litter and things that are just not supposed to be there. So that's a core focus, and that will be affecting the industry a lot over the next few years. And we really encourage people to engage with those consultations. Then at the top right, you can see 2 reports. The one in the middle is the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. A panel published this research, and the recommendations there are second to none. We think it's a fantastic report. And the key recommendation is to develop a national plastics action plan where all the professionals and the public can comment and have their say as to how do we do this better. So that'll start in the new year. And then the MFE currently have a public consultation about reducing the impact of plastics on our environment, where they're looking to regulate some PVC packaging and some single-use items. Unfortunately, they've left off cigarette butts as single-use items. They most certainly are single-use, but there's still a lot we can do there. A lot of good that can come from that. But change starts with the first step. So Auckland Council has a network discharge consent, discharge to both the east and the west coast, but mainly to the east. And what they've got now in their regulations is a need for what's called a gross pollutant trap. A gross pollutant trap is anything that captures gross pollutants or macroplastics, so anything larger than 5 millimeters. So you still can convey water through the drain, but you're capturing these larger pieces of plastic and preventing them from forming microplastics down the way. So if you have a new development or an existing redevelopment in Auckland, these are going to become requirements for waste storage areas, like you can see here. Loading zones, because that's a lot of litter gets dropped off our loading zones, and communal waste storage areas. So to help with this, we've got a fantastic product that's been developed over 25 years, fits nice and neatly into the drain, very easy to install, very easy to maintain, as you can see on the left, just by hand. You'll need to maintain it about 3 to 6 times a year. And with doing that, you're capturing easily 600 to 800 pieces of litter if it's a car park or a commercial area. Some catch pits around sort of bus stops, we're getting over 2,000 pieces of litter per year. So a huge amount of potential for something that's pretty small, fits in the drain. We also have performance liners, so we can design it for specific pollutants like plastic nurdles. We know these are 2 millimeters typically in size, so we can get rid of those. So thank you very much to Sustainable Business Network for having us and for promoting sustainable business practices. We think there's a massive opportunity for business to lead with best practice. We know the regulations are going to come. It's a necessity. It's just a matter of, is it going to be in 2021 or 2022? So we encourage anybody who takes this as seriously as they should to use these great tools. There's affordable and effective solutions that exist. So just contact details below. If anybody wants to get hold of us, sales@stormwater360, or if you want to talk some more technical stuff with me, you can contact me on the email address below. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you, Darren. That's fantastic. And yeah, we've part of our work with our Gulf work for SBN has been about encouraging some of the businesses, particularly around the Gulf areas, to install litter traps where they can and look into that.
Yep.
And it's partly to install the kit. There they are, they're beautiful. And it's also partly just to get people to know that they've got a water course going through their property, because they often aren't aware of the connection to the water at all. And I think that's one of the great things about these things is since I've known they existed, you know, I'll walk around the streets and I'll have a little nosy every now and again in the drains to see if there's one there. And it's just to kind of get to know the world beneath our feet, and where those drains are with those little fish on them saying go straight to the sea. It really does go straight to the sea, and anything that goes in it will go there
quickly.
Too.
Yep.
It's absolutely. Well, fantastic. We'll talk to you more in the discussion. That is awesome. And any questions for Darren, do chuck them in the Q&A. I can see some coming through now, and we will get back to him in the discussion. So on to James Ferrier, who can come forward, and he and his company are looking at alternatives to plastics, to shift away from plastics into new materials. James, take it away.
Thanks, Andy. Firstly, just something I haven't actually got in this presentation which was really highlighted by Devina and Darren, is the importance of data in all this. I think that's something that gets overlooked by a lot of people, is that we really need to have that data about the state of how much pollution is actually going into the environment to really inform us on solutions. So I'll just say that now because that's not in the presentation, but that is something hugely important. So it's awesome to see that type of work that's happening, both on Devina, that's capturing that data out there, and Darren's technology, which can really be a useful measurement tool, not only just to stop that plastic going in. So, alrighty, so kia ora, everyone. My name's James, and I am the CEO and one of the co-founders of BioFab. We're a biotech startup that's working with just one of many solutions to addressing the problems of plastic and pollution. Particularly, we're working on a replacement to polystyrene, but any questions can come after that. So obviously, what was highlighted today was the harm that and the problem of plastic in our environment, particularly in the Hauraki Gulf. So I think before I talk about any of the potential sort of solutions on the material side or the end-of-life processing side of plastics, I think the biggest thing here that everyone can do, and it doesn't require any fancy technology or anything, is to reduce the amount of plastic or items that we buy that come in plastic, because that can be the simplest thing, that if we all just start looking at cutting out things that aren't necessary, we could hit a 5-10% reduction in a very quick period of time, and that just is changing our the culture of how we buy things. So, but some of the interesting stuff to talk about today is, I'll start off with some of the material solutions that are out there that you as a consumer or even a manufacturer can look towards to start making a positive impact. So firstly, I've broken this down into 3 categories. So starting off with bio-based polymers. So these are things that can either be bio-based and biodegradable, such as your PLAs, PHAs, and PBSs. PLA has become quite popular over the last few years, being touted as a compostable solution. We've got other solutions out there, such as bio polyethylene or bio PET. Now, when it comes to the waste side of these materials, they can still create a problem, but there is a benefit there that we are at least sourcing the raw material for these types of plastics here from renewable resources. We've also got cellulose-based materials, so that can be things such as films. Again, as they go into the environment, they're something that can be non-toxic. So, the reality is that we might not 100% stop the inflow of plastics into the environment. So I think it's important in our material selection that we do not pick plastics that are going to be toxic for marine life and any environment where plastics may go into. Now put PBAT in there as well. That's something that's quite common with PLA bags. But all of these are examples of plastics that can be seen as bio-based polymers. Some of them are actually fossil-based, such as PBAT, but they're still biodegradable. So That's just highlighting that bio-based polymers is not one single thing out there. So the next sort of material change that we can look at making to replace things like plastics, polystyrene, this falls into textiles as well. The space that I'm particularly working in is packaging at the moment, but 100% recognise that synthetic fibres and textiles is a huge problem as a microplastic that is escaping into the environment. So I think keeping it specific to New Zealand, some great opportunities here is utilising things such as hemp and wool. There's flax in there as well. So changing the fibres from synthetic to natural fibres. Again, those fibres, when we wash our clothes, they will still break down into small plastics that might get through the system and out into the environment. But again, at least they will be non-synthetic and non-toxic, making sure that we're not using toxic dyes with that as well. Another solution is mycelium, which is what I'm particularly working on with BioFab. This can be seen as a replacement to polystyrene. So again, this is completely not even using a plastic, although we would be replacing it. We simply use wood chips and a very natural and organic process to bind it together using the root structure of fungi. So that excites me, where this technology is not going to solve all the plastic problems, but it is, I think, one of many that we need to adopt to start making a positive change. And as a final one there, we've got woody fibers. So this is pulp products. So with these, it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, we want to make sure that these types of products we want to make sure with these products that we aren't coating them in plastic, because that makes them hard to recycle. And another big thing here is designing into plastics. So as was said, plastics are not the enemy here, but they can definitely be part of the solution, especially when we're looking at reusable plastics, making them durable, washable, and returnable. I think material standardization has a big role to play. There are going to be some items in the short term where there aren't available solutions that aren't plastic to switch to. So at least not having as wide a variety of plastics out there will make recycling a lot easier. And the importance of life cycle analysis as well. I think it's really important for people looking to new technologies that they understand what effect the change that they will make. And this is around avoiding greenwashing, because some solutions that might seem green on the outside might not in reality actually be better. So again, driving that back to data being an important part of making decisions. So just quickly spending a bit of time on some of the potential process solutions when it comes to end of life. I think there's some really amazing opportunities here that will arise from how we process, current plastics. And I think some of the importance of changing materials will tie directly into creating these opportunities for end of life processing. So a big part of that, I believe that we need to find a way how to make money out of capturing waste. At the end of the day, I think it was a recent World Economic Forum report put out that only 2% of plastics around the globe are currently being recycled. So I believe wholeheartedly that we need to improve and encourage recycling, but I think that this data shows that we need to have other solutions in there. So under recycling, we might have traditional mechanical recycling, cutting them back down to small pieces, remounting them again. Chemical recycling, I think that can play a huge role with bioplastics. When we talk about composting, I think composting food contaminated bioplastics is a great solution, but at the end of the day, composting might not be the only solution we should rely on when it comes to bioplastics. I say that because we don't want to live in a world where we're having to cut down trees just to run the composters. And I think the up and down cycle of products as well. So that kind of can tie into the reuse side of this argument, that we just need to change the culture of waste. And again, not littering, not throwing out, designing into packaging ways that we can reuse them for, or designing in an end of life, so we can make sure that at the end of that particular life cycle that there's a new one there waiting for it. Composting, there's a lot of discussion around here, not really enough time to talk too much about this, but there is home and commercial composting. Can be two very different things, but again, there's recent trials that are going to be going underway soon, trying to understand this better. So I think composting can have a huge role to play as well, especially with food contaminated plastics. Other solutions to look at, though the technologies might not be right there yet, is gasification. There might just be some waste that is going to be too hard to ever have a proper end of life for. And I think putting them into landfill isn't a long-term solution. I think gasification technology, if we can make sure that this isn't releasing pollutants into the atmosphere, can provide a great solution to empty landfills as well. Now, I'm not sure on the data around the effect of landfills into the Hauraki Gulf, but and anaerobic digestion is something that I think may or may not have some merit. I think we see plants potentially opening up around New Zealand soon. So that is something that might be coming into the space within Auckland, to be looking at ways to get rid of our waste and stop it going into the Hauraki. So that's pretty much it. There's lots there to talk about, and that was only really touching the tip of the iceberg, but keen to hear any questions that the audience might have around that.
Fantastic, thank you, James. Good introduction to some of the complexities about trying to move on from plastics into a kind of new world, and how to address those complexities through data, through checking what we're doing as we go, because we can't move too fast. We've already seen in some business areas, people jumping on particular solutions and finding they're actually not quite all they seem. So that's something for us to get used to, and also as consumers being able to sort of sift through those stories and see exactly what's coming out when people say we've got new packaging when it's green or compostable or whatever, what exactly that means. And it's something we're going to have to learn about in the same way we've learned about organics, and we've learned about the fair trade elements of the stuff that we buy. So that's fantastic. That's our three presenters. We've got a ton of questions set up for us. I'll bring them all back in now and kick off a little bit of a discussion, just to sort of throw these ideas around and see where we get to. One of the things that I was going to ask about to kick off was, funnily enough, from yesterday night. I was doing a thing on building fires with my scout group. I'm a scout leader, and we're talking about plastic, because they found plastic on the floor. Can they burn it? Obviously you can. It's oil, but they didn't know that, and I found that interesting. Davina, do you think there's a kind of an educational role to be played here? Do you think there's still quite a lot of gaps in what the general public know, even the basics of what some of these plastics are made out of and how they function in our environment?
Yes, we do know that plastics have been gaining a lot of traction over the past couple of years. But I think what would help most is to have it in education systems, in communities, even in our business communities, just letting people know the extent of the problem and letting people know the different types of plastics. And even when it comes to recycling, as James said earlier, if you can only recycle plastics that are clean. So making sure that you wash your plastics first, dry them, and then put them in a recycling unit, and to know what kind of plastics can be recycled. And the rules and regulations keep changing, whether it's from number 1 to number 2 or all the way to number 6. So having a proper plan out there so that we can take actionable steps would be super helpful.
Yeah, that's perfect. I've certainly learned a huge amount. One of the big pieces of work the Sustainable Business Network's been doing is the plastics packaging masterclasses, where we've got together with businesses and organisations and local authorities to get everyone in a room and talk about what plastics are doing and how we can improve them. And every session we start with the session where we just put out a load of rubbish and say, right, what's recyclable and what's not. And it's incredible to see these people who work in the industry and they're experts still not clear. And even the people running the session get caught out by at least one piece every time and say, no, because of the dye or because of the sticker. So it's quite hard. So you can see why, James, you can see why they're kind of switching it out it seems like a really nice solution, because then you don't have to worry about it so much. So the material that you're using, what would happen to that if that got out in the Gulf?
So I'll be careful on what I say, because I'm very hopeful that it is not nearly as pollutant. It is not toxic. I want to be careful in saying that it would be safe to eat for marine life without having the data to show that. But this material is not a polymer. It's not a biopolymer. It is literally taking a natural process of mycelium growth. So again, with the fungi, that's the fruit on top of the soil. but mycelium is its root structure underground. It already has a role where it works very synergistically with nature, and we are simply using that as a glue to bind wood chip together. So we're using organic hemp hurd at the moment. So from my understanding, we have a completely organic packaging product. And but again, I don't want to encourage people to necessarily throw that out into nature because that encourages littering. But I do believe that like what we're trying to create is a culture where we get rid of the term waste. Like this material, the stupidest thing to do with it is send it to landfill, or we want to try and create value for it for someone in its end of life so that they want to go out there and spend money on collecting it back. I think if we don't have any type of drive to recollect waste, whether it's our product or others, it makes it just very easy for people to throw it away or people to encourage that. So it's really trying to change that culture that we should design into our packaging products, new ends of life at the end of them that aren't just landfill.
Yeah, this is the concept of the circular economy that we work strongly with, again, with SBN, and saying that these are just, there should not be such a thing as waste. It should be resources that stay in loops and get reused and reused and reused. Darren, how are we playing up against other, say, OECD nations or comparative nations around the world in terms of the amount of waste we're generating and how we're managing it? Because it's always good to get a sense of, you know, how we're doing.
Yeah, so, you know, the bigger your population, the more waste you're going to generate. That's quite a linear trend. Whether you're doing well within that trend or not, doesn't really matter. There's, you know, there's a certain amount that leaks to the environment. So there's a lot of process and focus on waste management practice, but we've also got this whole other network with, you know, drains that go out to the ocean that are not getting looked at as much. So I think in terms of, you know, regulations here, we're a bit concerned because of the Three Waters reform. The focus is certainly being put on drinking water since we've just gone through the worst drought that Auckland's ever faced. So there is a very, very dire need for drinking water reform, but also wastewater. So we've got a lot of wastewater overflows that go to the ocean, which is, you know, in this day and age, I think societal pressure don't think that that's acceptable. But to, you know, there's more than 1 million drains across New Zealand. So it's a tall order to try and capture litter from all of them. But, you know, people like the state of California, they've got a zero tolerance to plastics in their water. So they have a full trash capture policy where they want to capture litter going down every single drain across the whole state of California within the next 10 years. And they're more than halfway through that already. So I think if you compare us to them, we lag behind significantly.
Mm-hmm. There is work going on a fantastically named Central Interceptor, which sounds like something from Star Wars, isn't there? Which is to try and divert that away and stop these overflows into our water system, which is a good thing to see. These kind of we talked about litter at the far end of it, but in terms of the production litter as well, we hear a lot about the nurdles, the stuff that is ground up to make all the plastics. Is that something, Devina, you're seeing in your studies, and Darren, that you're seeing kind of turning up?
Should I answer first, Darren?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So in my trawls and in my fish, I did not find any nurdles. So what happens is when plastic sits in the ocean for a long time, bacteria colonize it, making it heavy. It's known as biofouling, and they end up sinking to the bottom of the ocean seafloor. So 70% of our plastics sink. And with nurdles, most of them wash up. So most of them are found in sediments, beach sediments. I had one colleague of mine who was investigating what snapper eat, and she found a single piece of nurdle. But while I was working at the boat, we found plenty of nurdles in the storm water drains that we put in the viaduct. So it's
there you go. Yeah, so it's quite prevalent.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about some of these? Sorry, it's Darren as well, but the technologies that are out in the ocean now, sort of trying to collect litter at that level.
Yeah, so, you know, cleaning out the ocean water, that's a big necessity. But I think what you really want to get is stopping it at the source. If you're already in the ocean trying to clean that water, I think you're a little bit too late. It's much easier to capture things at source than it is to capture it. You know, the ocean's a pretty big place. And also the thing about plastics, especially these sort of biodegradable plastics, is that they break down relatively quickly to form microplastics. So what we're advocating for is to capture things while they're still quite fresh and large, because that's much easier. As soon as they start to break down, you've got a much harder process. So yeah, we definitely have a long way to go to clean up the oceans. But the best thing we can do is stop things at source now, so that the problem doesn't exacerbate and get worse.
Or even James, as you're saying, design them out again as well, so that we don't use them in the first place. What about some of the trickier? I mean, you've got a solution there, looking like a solution for some of the polystyrene usages. So the kind of other end of the difficulty factor we're seeing in the masterclasses is things like soft plastics. Is there any sort of anything on the horizon for those? Because it seems like they're a tough cookie to crack. And is it that we're going to have to change the systems around them? Some of these long supply chains that we're using plastics for.
Yeah, there's two definite big opportunities there. One is the material, because a lot of soft plastic actually by weight, we use a lot less of it if we try to use a rigid plastic to replace that. And in many cases, they're very high barrier film that has a huge amount to do with keeping food fresh. Again, we don't keep that food fresh, then we have a food waste problem on the other end of that. So it's not a simple fix necessarily. But we do see things like PBS and cellulose-based films. They can be multi-layered to achieve that performance outcome. The cost of them are coming down as they get used more. And but again, if the only end of life for them is composting, I just think that if there are ways to recycle those, like in the same way there are problems with multi-layered plastic films and recycling, that same problem can come in with bioplastics. But changing logistical supply chains, I think, I don't know the exact answer to it, but the way that we move food, the idea that we could start decentralizing the way that we grow and make our food so that it's closer to the end consumer, can be one way to make sure that less time is spent in transit and logistic supply chains and more time, being ready for the consumer to buy. That can help make some of that trade-off by using less plastic packaging, but increasing the amount of shelf time that it has for the consumer to buy. So I think, as you can see with all of this, and what I think is really exciting about all this, that there's not going to be just one solution to all these problems. So that there's huge, economic opportunity for people to try and solve these.
Yeah, so it's definitely a team game, eh? That's one of the reasons why we put the masterclass together. You need to get everyone in the room, because otherwise you're all trying to do different things and there's no sort of shared knowledge. And the depth of knowledge is incredible when you see the detail of the chemistry and how this is all working together. Did we see? I don't know if Darren, you were still collecting through the lockdown period at all, but in terms of behaviour change, did you see kind of marked shifts happen there? Was that a kind of an opportunity to see how we might live?
Yeah, so we investigated two factors. So there's natural factors. So there's, water flows downhill and it rains in the rainy season and it's a bit dry in the dry season. So those impact transport of sediment, nutrients, metals, pathogens, plastics, a whole array of contaminants that go into our stormwater. Then there's also the social factors. So there's the social factors in terms of, people litter. Litter doesn't litter itself. People leave bins out that get blown over by the wind. And we litter mostly subconsciously. So one of the big factors is, smokers are more susceptible to littering because they flick cigarette butts, and that subconsciously has an influence. But what we found was a fairly consistent number of plastic items per season. So we didn't see this huge increase in summer and a big drop off in winter, and then specifically in the lockdown months. So it's very interesting, and I think there's very, very many variables at play. It's very difficult to say litter travels more in the rainy season. I don't think that's entirely true. I think it's also transported by wind. So it's there's a lot of research, and this is the kind of stuff that Devina's doing brilliantly. There's also a lot of good research coming out of North America, where they're looking at things like adsorbed chemicals on plastic, increasing their toxicity, something else that Devina spoke about. So again, another reason to try and trap it at the top of the hill, not at the bottom of the hill.
Absolutely. And Devina, in your studies, did you look elsewhere at what the kind of nightmare scenario might be if we don't get to grips with this? Are there places around the world where it's a lot worse than it is here? And what could we be looking down the barrel of if we don't intervene?
Compared to global studies, we are almost on par. But when it comes to plastics in the ocean, a lot of it depends on the ocean current and Gaia. So we had a PhD student in 2014, 2016, and she looked at plastics in the South Pacific, and no research had been done there. But the most number of plastics she found was in the South Pacific gyre, where all of them, you've heard of the garbage patch in North Atlantic. So we have the same one down here in the Southern Hemisphere. And when it comes to plastic ingestion by fish, I want to strongly emphasize that the base is not to fear monger when it comes to saying, okay, fish are ingesting plastic, so we don't consume fish anymore. There's still a lot of research to be done on whether these chemicals leach out into fish tissue, if they affect their physiology. There's a bit of research done, but they are mostly in tank experiments in the lab where you feed a lot of plastics to them. So to make sure, to remember that there's still ongoing research done. And as I would say very cautiously that most of them go into the gut and pass out. But we don't know if nanoplastics that are much in the nano scale, if they go into the tissues or if they go anywhere else and affect their reproductive function, for example. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but to make sure that we just don't stop consuming fish too. Yeah, there are other factors that affect fish populations.
This is one of the concerns.
I was just going to say, it seems pretty silly as a solution to stop consuming fish, as a solution to plastics in the ocean. That seems silly that anyone would even. Yeah,
it's a worrying sign. But as we've talked to throughout the series, we do need to get a grip on our sustainability when it comes to fish and fisheries as well. But yeah, it would seem a terrible trauma. It's kind of like when they say, you'll all be eating jellyfish in a few years because of the heating of the sea and stuff like those sorts of stories. And it's worthwhile keeping an eye on them. But the bottom line is we don't want to get there. We don't want to be in that position.
No, but exactly the scary thing is that we might have to. But it just seems so. It's just ridiculous that we live in a world where we might have to, and regulate people eating fish because there's too much plastic in it.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, I must admit, some of the meetings I've had on plastics, I thought this is the meeting that should have happened 80 years ago when they started putting this stuff into the environment. Not now, not where we're at. So next steps, James. What's the next steps for you? How far along are you with your products, and are there other products in the pipeline?
So we are just in the process of actually trying to get that all-important thing that doesn't grow on trees together to build our first plant. And then that's going to allow us to start supplying some of this material in its current state as the polystyrene replacement. But we're also going to be doing a lot of research into what happens when we can press this material for new products away from polystyrene replacements. Huge amount of research into the unique value of fungi in New Zealand as well. So that might lead us into, enzymes from fungi that can eat plastic. Looking at how we can take that process that we're doing naturally and move that into more of an industrial process. So lots of cool things around fungi and using agricultural byproducts to make products with. So yeah, if anyone's interested to talk more, send me contact details out or anything like that. So keen to always be in conversations around this, because as you said before, I think we're just working on one solution, but it's important with all those solutions to talk with each other as well, because there's room for everyone, that's for sure.
Darren, are you seeing international take up on your ideas? Are you able to branch out and grow in this? Because one of the things we should say about all this is, we're presenting some pretty serious problems here, but problems are also challenges. And if New Zealand does get ahead of the curve, then we can start to lead other countries to better solutions as well, and do well and be prosperous.
Yep. So we've seen a huge demand for our products in international markets where trash capture is regulated. So the state of California, across the whole of the US, they've got quite a good legislative procedure with their Clean Waters Act, and the EPA do a lot of good. So despite the political afflictions that they're going through now, they do have good policy, and they really are leading the way in certain aspects. We're seeing a huge demand for the product in Canada and in Australia, but very little demand in New Zealand. So, you know, that's a bit of a worry for us. So that's our focus. But, you know, it's also important to point out that we are partnering with those countries. So with the US, Canada, and Australia, they are partners in climate change policy development. So there are people that are experts in doing good that we can, you know, just basically, you know, get on their coattails and go along for the ride and implement those good policies without having to do 10 years of political kind of lobbying or research. You know, there's a lot of quick wins that we can get to. And as the political situation gets more and more extreme with climate change, you know, all of these problems start to overlap. So plastics, emissions from, you know, things like concrete manufacturing and our transport industry, these are and the demand for water, the need for clean water, that's going to be, they're all one problem at the end of the day. So I think it's very exciting to be working in this space and great to see the solutions and the research that are being developed right here in New Zealand.
There's some serious momentum behind it, but we need to sort of clean up our own backyard first and foremost. Yep. Thanks all. That's the end of our discussion. Thank you so much, Devina Shetty, Darren Tiddy, and James Ferrier for joining me today. It's been another great discussion. Do go back as well. If you're interested in their products or research, go back. You can go onto Facebook Live and see the recording and dial back to pick up their website details and dial in. Thanks again to our sponsors, the Gulf Innovation Fund Together, a Foundation North initiative, and to Auckland Council for making this possible. And remember, there are still prizes to be won out there. So if you take a pledge to restore the Gulf at sustainable.org.nz, gifts to the Gulf, you can be in to win a Zilch EV free car hire or Lewis Road Creamy ice cream. Please go in and win it. Otherwise, I'll eat it. And it's not good if I eat that much ice cream. Register and attend all 4 sessions. If you've got to the end of this one, you've got 1 more session to go. You just need to pop your head in the door this time tomorrow, and you'll be in to win a double pass on the Auckland Whale and Dolphin Safari, which is where Devina did some of her studies, and you can see the beautiful things she saw there. And today's special prize is Kelly Tarleton's family pass. All you need to do is go down to the Facebook page, comment about someone doing something great to get plastic and keep plastic out of our oceans, and you can be in to win that. Jump in tomorrow for how transport choices affect the Gulf, our final part of this session. And thank you so much for joining us today. Goodbye.